On a small island in the South Pacific, there are people right now who will tell you without hesitation that they are living the happiest lives on planet Earth. Not wealthy lives, not safe lives. In fact, the United Nations has ranked their home the single most disaster-prone country on the entire planet, more at risk than anywhere else on Earth, from volcanoes, cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis, and rising seas, all at once, all the time. And yet, survey after survey, index after index, this same tiny nation keeps getting ranked among the happiest places on the face of the Earth. That is not a contradiction that makes sense on paper. A country that can lose entire villages to a single storm, that sits directly on top of one of the most violent volcanic fault lines in the world. That has almost nothing in the way of the wealth or infrastructure most of us consider basic to a good life, and its people are smiling more than almost anyone else on the planet. Tonight, we are going deep into that contradiction, into the daily life, the ancient customs, the language, the volcanoes, the cargo cults, and the astonishing resilience of a country most people couldn't find on a map if their life depended on it. This is Vanuatu, and by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why the rest of the world has so much to learn from a place most people have never even heard of. Let's start with where this place actually is, because the geography alone explains almost everything about how life here works. Vanuatu is a Y-shaped chain of 83 islands scattered across the southwestern Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,750 kilometers east of Australia, stretching out over more than 1,300 kilometers of open water. Of those 83 islands, only 65 are actually inhabited. The rest are empty, volcanic, jungle-covered specks of rock rising out of some of the deepest ocean water on the planet. The entire population of this country, spread across that enormous archipelago, is only around 300,000 people, which means Vanuatu has fewer citizens than a single mid-sized American city, distributed across a chain of islands longer than the distance from London to Rome. Roughly 3/4 of those 300,000 people live in rural villages. Not cities, not towns with paved roads and supermarkets, but small coastal and inland communities built around family land, subsistence farming, and fishing. The other quarter lives in the country's two real urban centers, the capital, Port Vila, on the island of Ifat, and a smaller town called Luganville, on the island of Espiritu Santo. Everywhere else, and we are talking about the vast majority of this nation's geography, is village life, connected not by highways but by dirt tracks, small boats, and increasingly by small aircraft hopping between grass airstrips carved out of the jungle. To understand how people actually live here today, you have to go back to how they got here in the first place, because the roots of Vanuatu's culture run extraordinarily deep. The first people to settle these islands were part of what archaeologists call the Lapita culture, a seafaring Melanesian people who arrived by canoe roughly 3,300 years ago, around 1300 BC. Think about what that actually means. These were not people stumbling onto an island by accident. They were expert navigators crossing enormous stretches of open, uncharted Pacific Ocean, in canoes, with nothing but knowledge of the stars, the wave patterns, and the flight paths of birds to guide them, settling one of the most isolated island chains on the entire planet more than 3,000 years before anyone in Europe knew it existed. It would take until the year 1606 for the first Europeans to even lay eyes on these islands, when a Portuguese explorer named Pedro Fernandes de Quiros arrived and, in one of history's more amusing navigational errors, became convinced he had discovered the fabled southern continent of Australia. He named the largest island Espiritu Santo, and the name stuck, even after Europeans eventually figured out this was not, in fact, Australia at all, just a tiny fraction of it. For most of the next 3 centuries, Vanuatu existed in relative isolation from the wider world, until the colonial powers of Europe eventually came calling in force. And what happened next is genuinely one of the strangest chapters in the entire history of colonialism. In 1906, Britain and France, unable to agree on who actually had the stronger claim to these islands, decided to simply rule them jointly, together in a bizarre dual administration they called the condominium. 2 separate colonial governments, 2 separate legal systems, 2 separate police forces, 2 separate school systems, and 2 separate currencies, all operating simultaneously on the exact same tiny group of islands. The arrangement was so genuinely chaotic and confusing to actually live under that the local population came up with their own nickname for it, calling it not the condominium, but the pandemonium, a joke that has survived in Vanuatu's popular memory for well over a century. That strange dual rule lasted until 1980, when the islands finally won independence and the nation renamed itself Vanuatu, a word that comes from the local languages, meaning, roughly, our land stands forever, a name chosen deliberately to reclaim an identity that had been split in two by foreign powers for 74 straight years. Now, let's actually go inside how people live day to day, because this is where Vanuatu genuinely diverges from almost anywhere else on Earth. At the center of daily life across the vast majority of these islands is a single powerful concept called custom. It is a Bislama word, derived from the English word custom, but it means something far bigger than that translation suggests. Custom encompasses traditional law, spiritual belief, land ownership, ceremony, dance, art, storytelling, and social obligation. Essentially, the entire indigenous worldview and way of life that existed on these islands long before any European ship ever appeared on the horizon. When independence came in 1980, the founding political movement in Vanuatu made an explicit formal commitment to protecting and promoting custom as the foundation of the new nation's identity, and that commitment has held. Even today, in villages across dozens of islands, land is not bought and sold the way it is in most of the world. It is held communally, passed down through generations according to traditional systems of ownership and obligation that have nothing to do with a deed or a bank. Life is organized around family, clan, and village obligation far more than around individual wealth or personal property. And the entire economic logic of daily existence in rural Vanuatu often runs on reciprocity rather than currency, exchanging food, livestock, and labor to build and maintain relationships, mark important life events, and keep the social fabric of a community intact. And if you want to understand where that social fabric actually gets woven together, in villages across Vanuatu, it happens in a specific place called the Nakamal. The Nakamal is traditionally the men's house, the communal gathering space at the heart of village life, where community decisions get discussed, disputes get settled, ancestors get honored, and every single evening, kava gets shared. Kava is a mildly sedative drink made from the ground root of the kava pepper plant, mixed with water and consumed from a coconut shell, and it is genuinely difficult to overstate how central it is to daily social life across these islands. Nakamals function today almost like the neighborhood bar does in other parts of the world, except the drink connects directly back through centuries of tradition to communication with ancestral spirits, and the ritual of drinking it together, every evening as the sun goes down, is one of the primary ways community bonds get maintained generation after generation. Now here is where Vanuatu becomes almost impossible to compare to anywhere else on Earth. This tiny nation of roughly 300,000 people speaks over 110 distinct indigenous languages. Some estimates, factoring in dialectal variation, push that number even higher, past 130. Think about that ratio for a second. A country with fewer people than a single American college town has more distinct languages spoken within its borders than almost any other nation on the planet has in total. It gives Vanuatu the highest number of languages per capita of any country in the world, a linguistic diversity so extreme that people from one village might not be able to understand people from a village on the very next island over without a shared bridge language. And that bridge language exists. It's called Bislama, a Melanesian pidgin that developed over generations of trade, colonization, and cross-island contact, blending English, French, and indigenous vocabulary into a language that essentially every person in Vanuatu can speak and understand, alongside whichever of the country's ancestral languages is specific to their own island or village. Bislama, along with English and French left over from that strange dual colonial administration, are the three official languages of the country today. But underneath all three of those, in daily village life, it's the local ancestral tongue that still carries the deepest cultural weight. That extreme linguistic fragmentation actually produced one of the most remarkable art forms anywhere in the Pacific, something UNESCO has formally recognized as a piece of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. It's called sand drawing. Across the central and northern islands of Vanuatu, people developed a tradition of tracing elaborate, continuous geometric patterns directly into sand or volcanic ash using a single, unbroken line. Patterns that encode entire stories, myths, songs, and even practical information like how to prepare a particular food or perform a particular ceremony. Because so many different language groups exist within such a small geographic space, sand drawing evolved as a visual language that could cross those linguistic boundaries entirely, a way of communicating complex ideas and preserving stories that did not depend on everyone speaking the same words. It's an entire information system, drawn in the dirt with a finger, passed down for generations, in a country where the next village over might not understand a single word you say out loud. Religion in Vanuatu tells a similarly layered story. Christian missionaries arrived in force during the 19th century, and today Christianity, spread across Presbyterian, Anglican, and Roman Catholic denominations, is the dominant formal religion across the islands. But rather than replacing casteism, in most communities, Christianity settled in alongside it, blending with traditional spiritual beliefs about land, ancestors, and ceremony rather than erasing them outright. It produced a genuinely unique spiritual landscape, one where a village might attend Sunday church services in the morning and gather in the Nakamal that same evening for kava, and rituals with roots stretching back long before any missionary ever set foot on these shores. And nowhere is that blend of the ancient and the strange more visible than on the island of Tanna, home to one of the most genuinely unusual religious movements anywhere on Earth, something called the John Frum cargo cult. During the Second World War, American military forces poured into the Pacific in enormous numbers. And for the first time, people on remote islands like Tanna witnessed something completely outside their frame of reference. Massive ships, aircraft, and an almost unimaginable quantity of manufactured goods, food, medicine, weapons, and equipment, all delivered by American servicemen who seemed to have unlimited material wealth arriving from the sky and the sea. It is still actively practiced today, generations later, with followers on Atana holding an annual celebration every February 15th called John Frum Day, marked by elaborate military-style parades, followers carrying wooden replica rifles painted with the letters USA, marching in formal ceremony in genuine anticipation of a return that has been expected for over 80 years now. It is, depending on how you look at it, either one of the strangest surviving religious movements on the planet, or one of the most fascinating examples anywhere in the world of how a community processes an encounter with something completely outside its previous experience and turns it into an enduring system of belief. Tanna is also home to something else that pulls visitors from around the entire world, and it takes us straight into the volatile, fire-lit reality of daily life in Vanuatu. Mount Yasur is one of the most consistently active volcanoes on the planet, and remarkably, one of the most accessible. It has been erupting continuously, day after day, for what geologists believe may be hundreds, if not thousands of years. And unlike almost every other active volcano on Earth, visitors and locals alike can actually hike up to the crater rim and look directly down into the churning, glowing cauldron while it erupts beneath them. It is not the only volcanic threat in the country either. The island of Ambrym is home to a volcanic system ranked among the most explosive on the planet according to geological indices measuring historic eruption power, and volcanic activity across the archipelago is simply a constant, accepted backdrop to everyday existence, not a rare emergency, but a permanent feature of the landscape people build their entire lives around. And this is where we finally arrive at the paradox we opened this video with. Because living on top of one of the most violent volcanic and seismic zones on the planet is only part of what makes daily life in Vanuatu so genuinely precarious. According to the United Nations University's own World Risk Report, Vanuatu is officially ranked as the single most at-risk country on the entire planet for natural disasters. Out of every single nation on Earth, not one of the most at risk. The most at risk, full stop. The reasons go well beyond the volcanoes. Its position in the South Pacific puts it directly in the path of devastating tropical cyclones, and its limited infrastructure, spread thin across dozens of remote, often mountainous islands, means the country has genuinely limited capacity to respond when disaster strikes, compared to wealthier nations facing similar hazards. That vulnerability is not theoretical. In March of 2015, Cyclone Pam tore directly through the archipelago, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the South Pacific, destroying thousands of homes and killing at least 17 people across the islands. Survivors describe entire villages flattened in a matter of hours, outdoor kitchens and traditional homes, built from local materials that have sustained communities for generations, blown apart in a single night. And Cyclone Pam was not a once-in-a-generation event. It was simply the most visible, most internationally reported example of a pattern that plays out across Vanuatu's islands on a near-constant basis. Cyclones, earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity striking somewhere in the archipelago essentially every single year. Longtime residents in Vanuatu can tell you stories that sound almost impossible to believe from anywhere else in the world, surviving multiple major cyclones, earthquakes, and volcanic events across the span of a single lifetime, sometimes losing family members to landslides or storms and simply continuing to live, rebuild, and stay on the same land their families have occupied for generations. On top of all of that, climate change is actively making Vanuatu's situation worse in real time. As a low-lying island nation, Vanuatu is acutely exposed to rising sea levels, more intense storm systems, and shifting agricultural conditions that directly threaten the subsistence farming the majority of the rural population still depends on for daily survival. The threat has become significant enough that Vanuatu's government made international headlines by formally declaring a climate emergency and spearheading a groundbreaking push at the United Nations, seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the legal obligations wealthier, higher-emitting nations hold toward vulnerable countries like Vanuatu. This is a country of 300,000 people, largely living in villages with limited electricity and no paved roads across most of its territory, leading a legal charge at the highest court in the world against the largest, wealthiest economies on the planet, because the water is rising around their homes and they are determined to make sure the rest of the world is held legally accountable for it. So here's the actual question. This entire video has been building toward: how does a country facing this level of relentless, compounding natural threat, cyclones capable of flattening entire villages, volcanoes that never stop erupting, earthquakes, tsunamis, and a rising ocean actively swallowing the coastline, consistently rank among the happiest places on the entire planet? Because it does, repeatedly, across multiple independent well-being indices conducted by researchers around the world. And the honest answer, based on what people who have actually lived there and studied there consistently describe, comes down to something that has almost nothing to do with material wealth or physical safety, and everything to do with the strength of the social and cultural fabric we've spent this entire video walking through. When land is held communally rather than individually, when a family's security depends on relationships and reciprocal obligation within a village rather than on a bank account, when identity is rooted in custom, in language and ceremony, and in a direct, unbroken connection to ancestors going back 3,000 years, disaster does not sever that connection the way it might in a place built around individual wealth and private property. A cyclone can destroy a house built from local materials, and a village can, and does, rebuild it together, because the thing that actually holds a community together in Vanuatu was never really the house in the first place. It's everyone still gathered at the Nakamal that evening, sharing kava, telling stories, honoring ancestors, and simply continuing on the exact same way people on these islands have been continuing on since long before anyone in the outside world ever knew this remarkable, resilient corner of the Pacific even existed. That is the real story of how people live in Vanuatu. Not a simple postcard of turquoise water and palm trees, although there is plenty of that too. It is 83 islands of extraordinary linguistic diversity, ancient tradition, active volcanoes, devastating storms, a religious movement still waiting for cargo that never came, and a population that has somehow built one of the strongest, most resilient, and by nearly every independent measure, happiest societies on the face of the earth, directly on top of the most dangerous ground on the planet. It's a place that forces you to ask an honest question about what actually makes a life good, wealth and safety, or community, connection, and a culture strong enough to survive absolutely anything the earth and the ocean can throw at it. And after everything we've just walked through, the people of Vanuatu already seem to have answered that question for themselves a very long time ago.